Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about new ways to solve the climate crisis with my guest, John Berger, Ph.D. He is an environmental science and policy specialist, a prize-winning author, consultant, educator, and journalist. He has written and edited over 11 books, including his most recent book, Solving the Climate Crisis, Frontline Reports from the Race to Save the Earth. His journalism has appeared in Scientific American, Los Angeles Times, and the Boston Globe. He also serves as a senior research fellow with the Pacific Institute. He is the U.S. Environment Correspondent for Sustain Europe and is winner of the 2015 International Book Award for Science and is a nominee in 2024 for the Rachel Carson Award. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you back on Environmental Directions.
Well, thank you, Nancy. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm happy to be talking with you today.
I'm always interested in your new research, and you have so much incredible information and stories in your book. We're not going to have time to cover it all, but we are going to talk about a few interesting examples that you have presented and ways that we can change our current lifestyle to help solve the climate problem. First of all, let's talk about what the climate crisis is, because at one time there were climate crisis deniers, but as you point out in your book, that's sort of gone by the wayside, and now people are just avoiding the regulations to take care of the problem. What is the evidence of the climate crisis?
The evidence is a tremendous increase in the concentration of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere and the rise in global average temperature that we have experienced as a result of that increase in greenhouse gas. There is plenty of evidence of a climate crisis right now, all the way from the Arctic to the tropics and in between. We are in an accelerating climate emergency. As we increase global temperature, we increase the prevalence of vast floods and torrential rains and hurricanes that have the force of a clear explosive practically and flatten everything in their path. We have seen and are seeing a shocking drop in the population of all vertebrate species and insects. That's not entirely, of course, due to climate change, but climate change is a force multiplier that is exacerbating the impacts of habitat loss and other insults that we commit with respect to the environment.
In fact, you want our president to declare a climate emergency so that actions can be taken whether or not Congress passes new laws or not.
I think that would be helpful. I think people would respond to that. They would sense that this is not just one of many important issues that need to be attended to, but that it is the paramount issue of our time and an existential issue.
And you discuss the need for climate diplomacy. How does that differ from other diplomatic operations?
Other diplomatic operations really involve usually a couple of nations or a handful of nations, but when it comes to the global climate emergency, we really need to have all 195 nations on board, although the vast majority of those nations contribute very little to the problem. Historically, the United States has been the greatest contributor, and today our current emissions are second only to China. Then comes India, and a few other nations are very significant. But if we were able to curb the emissions of the top 6 to 10 nations, we would have gone a long way towards abating and mitigating the risks of climate change and further temperature increases.
So much attention is made of emissions from fossil fuels to the point where you believe that we can provide 100% of our energy needs and put us on the pathway to solving the climate crisis if we developed wind, water, solar, and renewable resources without any fossil fuel burning of any kind. When would that be possible?
It's possible to do it as soon as we appropriate the funds and build the necessary infrastructure. In the case of each industry, we have the technological capacity to do it right now, but we haven't got the political will, and we don't have the plans in place to do so. And instead, we are investing heavily and continuing to expand investment in fossil fuel, even though in 85% of the world, clean, renewable technology is actually cheaper than going with legacy ways of generating power. And power, of course, is just one of the uses to which we put our energy resources. But in solving the climate crisis, I show that in every area of the economy, we could convert to safe, clean energy. Some areas it's a little more difficult than others, but I would say we have probably 98% of all of the technology ready now, proven, and economically cost-effective.
As you say, there are many ways that we can accelerate the clean energy revolution by having clean, efficient, pollution-free electric transportation, having buildings generating a surplus of clean energy, having farms and ranches that are more involved with protecting the soil, factories that produce materials, cement, steel, and others more cleanly, new fuels and plastic from waste and greenhouse gases. There seems to be a lot of different ways that we can make the changes, but who's investing? You point out in your book that just a small fraction of the trillions of dollars going to the Department of Defense could make the change if we just move that into solving this problem.
We have historically, as a nation, shown that when we're really deep concerned about an issue, for example, the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, or the global pandemic and its ramifications in the United States, we as a nation are able to come up with trillions of dollars in a relatively short order, in the space of a year, for example. And over a period of years, we've spent something like $7 or $8 trillion on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and elsewhere in the world. We need to begin to reprioritize. The war on terrorism, horrible as it is, only takes a relatively few lives annually. But climate change has already cost the world millions of lives, and it's going to take many, many more millions, even in the United States, as a result of the increased prevalence of heat waves. Thousands more people die every year, and in the aggregate, since about 1997, I calculate that something on the order of 160,000 Americans have died as a result of illnesses and exposure to excessive heat. This is a real problem now, and we need to prioritize the climate crisis virtually above all other global and national issues. We need a national clean energy mobilization to address this problem, because it is only going to get worse if we don't successfully address it.
You also talk about climate refugees, and I've been to Africa. I've seen the desertification of lands. I've seen the loss of ecosystems, rainforests in South America and Asia, and how destructive they are, and people are losing their livelihood because of it. Where are they going to go? Where are they going to survive? We know of flooding in many, many different countries and other natural disasters that are exacerbated by the climate crisis.
We don't have to go to Africa to see climate refugees. We can see climate refugees massing on the southern border of the United States. You only have to go to Texas or Louisiana, and now to many cities where the migrants have been bused, thanks to governors on the southern border. So we are seeing a vast increase increase in migration from Central America and sometimes from Mexico because of drought conditions that make it impossible for people to farm successfully for lack of water. In desperation, they go to the cities, find that conditions there are terrible, and then decide to stake everything on migrating to the United States southern border. And this problem, which is already serious, will be even more intractable if we continue disrupting the climate and causing global temperature to continuously increase. The United States, by the way, has been very vocal about the dangers of climate change, and we're not doing nothing. But on the other hand, at the same time, we are the world's largest producer of oil, the largest producer of natural gas, the third largest producer of coal, and we are a big exporter of these fossil fuels at the same time as we are giving lip service to addressing the climate crisis.
In fact, you want to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, and you point out that if we go to a clean energy transition, we will actually create millions of jobs, and it can be more economical if we did so rather than supporting the fossil fuels.
That's clearly true. When you are dependent on fossil fuels, you're dependent on a source of energy that tends to be volatile in price and that has to be continuously replenished because you're setting it on fire, as Bill McKibben likes to say. But in the case of renewable technologies that are not only clean but that require no fuel, you're not actually having to continuously transport fuels all over the country or all over the world and generating even more carbon emissions in doing so. And you don't have to spend money every year for fuel. You make front-end investment in the capital equipment to run a solar power plant or a wind power plant or an energy storage facility, which is now increasingly becoming more economical. And you avoid the expense of continuously paying for fossil fuel, and you avoid the tremendous health costs of burning fossil fuels. We know that worldwide, roughly 8 million people die from air pollution that is largely caused by fossil fuels. Climate change is, of course, the cause of vast forest fires that also are worsening air quality and exposing tens of millions of people in the United States to toxic small particulate air pollution.
So often we don't consider the health costs, the environmental costs of our polluting activities, and that really needs to be incorporated into the total picture so that we can see what is the best approach to provide the best technology for us to live by. Your book describes many different kinds of activities that are going on, and it's well researched, it's well documented. You provide the footnotes and endnotes if people want to get more detail. But in addition, you have over 10 pages of ways that you suggest recommended climate policies and strategies, the to-do list. And we've talked about some of those: financing, phasing out fossil fuels, going to clean energy, renewable resources. But tell me more about the Civilian Climate Corps that you want to see established.
Well, that's something that's very similar to the Civilian Conservation Corps that was actually created in the 1930s under the Rooseveltian New Deal. We do have a Conservation Corps today, but it's just not amply enough funded, and it could be redirected to projects that would benefit the climate as opposed to conservation projects of all kinds. The budget is probably on the order of, I'm going to guess, maybe $30 million or something per year. It could be vastly increased, and we have millions of acres of land that need restoration, forests that need better care, soils that need to be repaired. If we put our natural resources into a healthier condition, they will be our allies in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
You are a senior research fellow with the Pacific Institute. What else does that institute do?
They primarily focus on water issues. Water is intimately related to climate, and the hydrological cycle is deeply affected by climate disruption. So they are trying to advise people on what to do and how to improve our our water management practices.
We're going to be talking more about the climate crisis with my guest, John Berger, who is author of Solving the Climate Crisis, Frontline Reports from the Race to Save the Earth, when we return in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Perlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with John Berger, who is an environmental science and policy specialist, prize-winning author, consultant, educator, and journalist. In your new book, because you've written over 11 on many of these different critical environmental issues, your book, Solving the Climate Crisis, Frontline Reports from the Race to Save the Earth, had wonderful stories about your meetings with so many of the climate experts and what is going on in different places in the world. And what I found most interesting was how you focus not just on what most people talk about, the emissions from cars and transportation and electrical power plants, but you focused on land and the soil. Can you explain how important it is to create farming that is more ecological and help restore our lands? Because you talked about Gabe Brown, a North Dakota farmer and rancher who saved his farm by going to carbon farming. What is that?
In carbon farming, a series of regenerative agricultural processes. For example, you use cover crops and you till them into the soil. You allow animals to graze land by fertilize it, so it is sort of a mixture of animal agriculture, animal husbandry, and ranching in the case of Gabe Brown. In the case of cropland, you may infuse the soil with compost, sometimes compost that is treated with mycorrhizal fungi that create helpful synergies with the plant roots and help the plants to absorb nutrients from the soil. Essentially, soil contains carbon that comes from plants that are absorbing carbon from the atmosphere during photosynthesis and incorporating the carbon dioxide into plant tissue and creating roots and stems and shoots and leaves. When the plant material dies, particularly soil roots that go deeply into the soil, then the carbon in that organic material becomes part of the soil and then enriches the soil, stimulates the microflora or microbial life in the soil, and then makes the soil more fertile, further stimulates plant growth, takes more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in a virtuous cycle. So this is the crux of regenerative agriculture. And by a few simple processes, like I mentioned, using cover crops, keeping the soil covered, not allowing it to be barren, but always having a root in the soil is thereby protected, and as the soil becomes richer in carbon and nitrogen, the microorganisms also contribute to the process of fixing or making the carbon more immobile and a permanent part of the soil. As the soil is richer, plants grow more vigorously, and so the whole system is kind of geared up in what can be called a virtuous cycle. And this enables not only carbon to be removed from the atmosphere and nitrogen, but it creates healthier plants and healthier animals and healthier people who eat the healthier food. It's produced in this way. On a global scale, we have billions of acres of rangeland and cropland. If we were to organize ourselves so that we provided ranchers and farmers with appropriate incentives in the form of carbon credits for the carbon that they could augment in their soil and thereby remove from the atmosphere, we could, on a global basis, actually have a significant significant impact on global warming. It wouldn't solve the problem, but we would be reducing the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere by using this relatively simple, risk-free, and economical, tried-and-true ancient method.
We all know how important it is to preserve our ecosystems, whether or not they're forests or grasslands. The natural ecosystems have a variety of life. They're essential for wildlife to be able to survive. Yet, we are still cutting down virgin forests. You objected to this plan to plant trillions of trees because single tree plantations do not replace the multiple variety of plants and animals in a natural ecosystem. It sounds so great. Let's plant trees. That will help solve our problem. But how we do it and where we do it makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I should clarify that I'm not against planting trees, even 1 trillion trees if you can do it. But I am kind of critical of the idea that we could, say, throw tree seeds out of an airplane or plant enormous numbers of trees somehow using mechanical systems without any follow-up to make sure that those trees are cared for and watered and protected and survive. And the survival rate of trees that are not carefully planted in the right place and using correct methods, that those trees are largely not going to survive and not going to provide the ecological benefits that they are supposed to. So I have no problem with planting trees, but they also need to be planted in the appropriate places geographically. In parts of the world where there's an albedo effect that reflects a lot of solar heat back out into space. And trees, for example, are more absorptive of solar radiation because they're darker in color than light-colored tundra, for example. So if you plant trees where they really don't belong and haven't grown historically, you're actually going to be increasing the amount of heat trapped by the Earth atmosphere system.
I certainly agree with you that we need the trees. We're for it, but it has to be done correctly, because I've done documentaries about clear-cut areas that have supposedly been replanted, but just with one kind of tree, and they're not cared for, and they die. And so you really have a dead landscape at that point.
It's an excellent point, Nancy. I wanted to say that we do not want trees to be planted in plantations because you lose the ecological benefits of a forest. I am in favor of restoring forests and using multi-species restoration of forests, but I'm not in favor of taking like vast landscapes and just planting them with certain kinds of fast-growing trees, pines or fir, because then you have really a tree farm. The trees are more susceptible to disease, to fires, to insects, and they don't provide the biodiversity benefits of a genuine forest ecosystem. They cannot function the way a forest functions in order to protect all of the components of the ecosystem.
We've been talking about some natural ecosystems. Let's talk about the built environment, because in your book, Solving the Climate Crisis, Frontline Reports from the Race to Save the Earth, you do have some fascinating stories about what cities like Copenhagen have done to be much more ecological. You have a story of the Bullitt Center in Seattle, which is one of only 10 living future buildings in the world that has reached net zero emissions. That's a very difficult task. I don't know how we're going to get the millions of other buildings to achieve that. I assume it takes the will of the governing bodies and the population and the people involved in companies to say, let's do this right. Copenhagen, of course, about 45% of their population ride bicycles or take transit to their jobs and homes. And in Seattle, they said, let's build a building, if we're going to believe in sustainability, that is sustainable.
The Bullitt Center, which you're describing, is really a marvel of energy efficiency and sustainable design. It's a 5-story office building. It was built at a competitive price, and it provides all of its own energy needs and actually exports excess energy profitably back to the utility. It provides all of its own water needs. It doesn't even need a connection to the utility system. It treats its own sewage. It uses only healthy materials in its construction and is built to last 250 years rather than, say, 50 years or even a little longer for a conventional building. It's very comfortable inside. I visited the Bullitt Center. The heat comes from geothermal heat, and it's circulated through radiant heat in the floor. It uses a great deal of natural daylight, and the exterior of the building is a little bit like the skin of an organism. It's just full of all kinds of sensors that detect sunlight, that detect wind speed, and that automatically adjust the windows so that you optimize ventilation, minimize the use of heating and cooling system. I don't think the building even needs a cooling system. The fact, though, that's quite remarkable is that this building is able to generate all its own electricity and then some, even in Seattle, which is one of the cloudiest cities in the entire United States.
Why did you pick Copenhagen as an example of a sustainable city?
I found Copenhagen to be a model of sustainability. They have come probably farther than any other city I know, a major city, I'm saying, not a small town or a little municipality, towards being climate neutral. They have the most comprehensive plan for achieving climate neutrality of any city that I know, and they constantly monitor their progress and then revise their plans accordingly. And I think that probably by 2028 or something like that, they will achieve carbon neutrality. The average citizen of Copenhagen, as a result of all of their efforts, has a carbon footprint that I would guess maybe 3 or 4 metric tons of CO2 per year compared to 15 metric tons in the United States. The way that Copenhagen has succeeded in its climate transition is, well, there's a lot of technological innovation, a lot of very smart people working on this problem, but they've also been very consultative in their efforts, and that they've brought in stakeholders from all branches of society, and they've collaborated on plans, and people in Copenhagen have a sort of an ownership stake in the success of the climate plan. It's part of Copenhagen's identity.
A great model to follow, and as many of your other stories in your book that I wish we had time to share, but I encourage everybody to read Solving the Climate Crisis, Frontline Reports from the Race to Save the Earth, because even if you know about the climate crisis, you have provided incredible research that's so easy to read for the average person to understand, and ideas to get motivated to do something. You have written over 11 books and have studied this issue so much. You're a science research fellow with the Pacific Institute. But when you were doing this book, what surprised you the most?
I was surprised by the fact that there really are no insurmountable issues here, and that even in industries that are very, very dirty today, industries such as the cement industry or the steel industry or others, we have technology that could just go an enormous distance towards cleaning them up. And in some cases, although you could, for example, make steel without a blast furnace or without an oxygen furnace by using electrolytic steel, that would go a long way toward eliminating the 8% of global industrial carbon emissions that come from steel industry.
How would you summarize your position?
The world could save trillions of dollars on energy. We could put tens of millions of people to work. We could avoid trillions of dollars in global warming damages, and we could save millions of lives, and we could stabilize energy costs. And the way to do this and to restabilize the climate is to go all out with a massive program to increase our use of clean energy and phase out fossil fuel energy. To do this, we need a massive political mobilization in this country, which could be the subject of a whole other conversation, Nancy.
We will have that conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I want to thank you so very much for continuing your superb efforts to educate the public. Thank you so much for being my guest.
It's my great pleasure, Nancy, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you today.
Thank Thank you. We'll have to have you again to discuss more of your excellent work. I have been speaking with John Berger, Ph.D., an environmental science and policy specialist, prize-winning author, consultant, educator, and journalist. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.